Do you know where I put my gold paint, Auntie? She painted some. Swans under bridges with water lilies. Old ladies at windows reading lugubrious Bibles. Tonight, she was decorating a shoebox for the box social they were having at the school the next night. No one expected her to come. She'd been quite ill for the last 3 weeks and hadn't appeared at the last institute meeting. Now, however, she felt well enough. She was a bit pale and looked much thinner, but she simply had to go. All that evening, she sat in the kitchen, cutting up old scraps of wallpaper and pasting them in various patterns on the shoebox with flour paste. Her box of lunch would be the prettiest there, and the men would bid so high for it. All she needed now was some gold paint. But of course, Aunt had gone to bed hours ago. If Sylvia had any profession at all, it was doing pretty little things like this. Little useless things. For her real vocation had apparently been to stay at home and help her aunt with the housework. What she needed now was something to line the box with. It would look so much more beautiful with the sandwiches and little bottle of olives set against some deep, rich color. Shoeboxes were so wonderfully white. The rain was falling in soft applause outside. Her fingers were white from the paste she'd been using. The candle in her hand sprouted a yellow willow leaf. She was in the outhouse, searching the tiny attic for a roll of gorgeous wallpaper she remembered her aunt having left there. Her father always forgot to put down the lids. The two holes stared at her like a man with a large eye and a small one. Finding what she'd wanted, she stepped out and stood still for a moment. The rain slopped the candle out. There was the wind in the elderberry bushes. The little things were breathing as heavy as if they were swimming across the North Sea. And another sound, that of St. James's bells all the way from town. Some of the notes were glossed, but she gathered it must be 12. No clock should have any less to say than 12, unless it were 1. At such an hour, so silent and so black. 12 black strokes. 12 black hair ribbons. She walked along the fence, beneath the fir trees a bit. The nightshade berries grew here with their wicked fruit. And the very next field was lined with furrows, as if it had been a large frown or a copybook. This was not her father's field. Someone else had plowed it. Furrow after furrow after furrow, his house lay away where he now lay sleeping. And she hated him. Then, her own house, a faint pale light from the 2 kitchen windows. There the decorated shoebox lay, almost ready for the box social. Every room of the house, both in its ancient and modern styles, met in Parliament on its flat, thin sides. Already, the event, the box social, gleamed in the distance like a lantern at the end of a dark stable. There were half a dozen cars parked outside the school. Cars have such beautiful behinds with ruby red roses that wink at you. Sylvia had walked along the fields. Neither her aunt nor her father wished to go. She carried the precious box in her arms. It was wrapped in brown paper to protect it from the rain. Why, you're better. Yes, I am. There were 30 people there. No one was as pale as she was. She looked like the queen on the playing card in her rich red dress, holding the gay box in her lap. All of the children's desks were cowering in one corner, for there was to be dancing. Already somebody was sprinkling boracic acid on the floor. Not that it really makes the floor slippery, but everyone is so sure that it does, and it feels that much more exciting. The fiddler played 6 tunes. He only knew 5. Mrs. Twite wasn't dancing, not even with her husband, because they used the school as a Sunday school on Sundays, and it would be like dancing in a church. Out stole a little green table, and then another green table, and another and another. Everyone would be playing euchre until they should dance again. I pass, paleface. Joker. There would be no more dancing now until after the lunch. Mr. Deloney, one of the 3 farmers in the neighborhood who owned a silo, was arranging the boxes on the teacher's desk. Sylvia was very careful with her hands, lest she eat them. And the teacher had pinned up the winter ornamental border with all of the gay coaches traveling from the north of the room to the south. This lovely box wrapped in green. What young gentleman would like to eat with a pretty young lady who has wrapped her box in green? All of the men were crowding up. Hers was almost the last, and he was bidding for it. $5 it had looked so nice. He came straight to her. I knew it was yours, recognized the wallpaper. Very pretty. You're not mad at me anymore. He sat down quite comfortably and began untying the black ribbon. The school clock that they had looked at together to see if it were recess time ticked loudly above them. He lifted the lid and sat staring at what lay inside. His great hands unusually white on the top of the green baize card table. Between them, the little shoebox glistened with scarlet wallpaper and gilt, like a fairy coffin. Inside it was the crabbed corpse of a stillborn child wreathed in bloody newspaper. I hated you so much, she said softly.
As a child, I lived on a farm not far from a small town called Partridge. In the countryside about Partridge, thin roads of gravel and dust slide in and out among the hollows and hills. As roads go, they certainly aren't very brave, for quite often they go round a hill instead of up it. And even in the flattest places, they will jog and hesitate absurdly. But then this latter tendency often comes from some blunder a surveying engineer made 100 years ago. And although his mind has long ago dissolved, its forgetfulness still pushes the country people crooked where they might have gone straight. Some of the farmhouses on these ill-planned roads are made of red brick and have large barns and great cement silos and soft, large straw stacks behind them. And other farmhouses are not made of brick, but of frame and clapboard that gleam with the silver film unpainted wood attains after years of wild rain and shrill wind beating upon it. The house where I was born was such a place. And I remember that whenever it rained from top to bottom, the whole outside of the house would turn jet black, as if it were blushing in shame or anger. Perhaps it blushed because of my father, who was not a very good farmer. He was what is known as an afternoon farmer. He could never get out into the fields till about 11:30 in the morning, and he never seemed to be able to grow much of anything, except buckwheat, which, as everyone knows, is the lazy farmer's crop. If you could make a living out of playing checkers and talking, then my father would have made enough to send us all to college. But as it was, he made enough to keep us alive, to buy tea and coffee, cake and pie, boots and stockings, and a basket of peaches once every summer. So it's really hard to begrudge him a few games of checkers or a preference for talking instead of a preference for plowing. When I was 6, my mother died of TB, and I was brought up by my Aunt Caroline and by my 2 older sisters, Noreen and Kate. Noreen, the oldest of us, was a husky, lively girl. She was really one of the liveliest girls I've ever seen. She rode every horse we had bareback, sometimes not with a bridle at all, but just by holding on to their manes. When she was 15, in a single day, she wallpapered both our kitchen and our living room. And when she was 16, she helped my father draw in hay, just like a hired man. When she was 12, she used to tease me an awful lot. Sometimes when she had teased me too much, I would store away scraps of food for days and then go off down the side road with the strong idea in my head that I was not going to come back. But then Noreen and Kate would run after me with tears in their eyes, and having persuaded me to throw away my large collection of breakfast toast crusts and agree to come back, they would both promise never to tease me again, although Kate, goodness knows, had no need to promise that, for she was always kind, would never have thought of teasing me. Kate was rather like me in being shy and in being rather weak. Noreen's strength and boldness made her despise Kate and me. But she was like us in some ways. For instance, Noreen had a strange way of feeding the hens. Each night, she would sprinkle the grain on the ground in the shape of a letter or some other pattern, so that when the hens ate the grain, they were forced to spell out Noreen's initials or to form a cross and a circle. There were just enough hens to make this rather an interesting game. Sometimes, I know, Noreen spelt out whole sentences in this way, a letter or two each night, and often wondered to whom she was writing up in the sky. Aunt Caroline, who brought me up, was most of the time sick in bed, and as a result was rather pettish and ill-tempered. In the summertime, she would spend most of the day in her room making designs in bouquets out of any flowers we could bring her, even dandelions, shepherd's purse, or Queen Anne's lace. She was very skillful at putting letters of the alphabet into a bouquet using two kinds of flowers. You know, one for the letters and one for the background. Aunt Caroline's room was filled with all sorts of jars and bottles containing bouquets, some of them very ancient so that they smelt up her room a bit, especially in the hot weather. She was the only one of us who had a room to herself. My father slept in the kitchen. Aunt Caroline's days were devoted to the medicine bottle and the pill box, making designs and bouquets, telling us stories, and bringing us up. Her nights were spent trying to get to sleep and crying softly to herself. When we were children, we were never worked to death. But still, we didn't play or read books all of the time. In the summertime, we would pick strawberries, currants, and raspberries. Sometimes we picked wild berries into milk pails for money. But after we had picked our pails full, before we could get the berries to the woman who had commissioned them, the berries would settle down in the pail. And of course, the woman would refuse to pay what she had promised because we hadn't brought her full pails. Sometimes our father made us pick potato beetles off of the potato plants. We would tap the plants on one side with a shingle and hold out a tin can on the other side to catch the potato bugs as they fell. And we went for cows and caught plow horses for my father. Every Saturday night, we children all took turns bathing in the dishpan. And on Sundays, after Sunday school, we would all sit out on the lawn and drink the lemonade that my father would make in a big glass pitcher. The lemonade was always slightly green and sour, like the moon when it's high up in a summer sky. While we drank the lemonade, we would listen to our Victrola gramophone, which Noreen would carry out of the house, along with a collection of records. These were all very old, very thick records, and their names were I Know Where the Flies Go, The Big Rock Candy Mountain, Hand Me Down My Walking Cane, and a dialogue about some people in a boarding house that went like this. Why can't you eat this soup? Various praising replies about the soup and its fine, fine qualities by all the 15 members of the boarding house. Then, so, why can't you eat this soup? And the non-appreciative boarder replies, because I ain't got a spoon. Even if no one laughed, and of course we always did, the record company had thoughtfully put in some laughter just to fill up the center. Those Sunday afternoons are all gone now. And if I had known I was never to spend any more like them, I'd have spent them more slowly. We began to grow up. Noreen did so gladly, but Kate and I secretly hated too. We were much too weak to face things as they were. We were weak enough to prefer what we had been as children, rather than what we saw people often grow up to be. People who worked all day at dull, senseless things and slept all night and worked all day and slept all night and so on until they died. I think Aunt Caroline must have felt the same when she was young and decided to solve the problem by being ill. Unfortunately for us, neither Kate nor I could quite bring ourselves to take this line. I don't know what Kate decided, but at the age of 11, I decided that school teaching looked neither too boring nor too hard. So, a school teacher I would be. It was my one chance to escape what my father had fallen into. To become a teacher, one had to go to high school for 5 years and go 1 year to normal school. 2 miles away, in the town of Partridge, there actually stood a high school. It was not until the summer after I had passed my entrance examination that I began to feel rather frightened of this new life ahead of me. That spring, Noreen had gone into town to work for a lady as a housemaid. At my request, she went to look at the high school. It was situated right next to the jail. And Noreen wrote home that of the two places, she'd much rather go to the jail, even although they had just made the gates of the jail 3 feet higher. Of that summer, I particularly remember one sultry Sunday afternoon in August when I walked listlessly out to the mailbox and, leaning against it, looked down the road in the general direction of town. The road went on past our house and then up a hill and then not over the top of the hill, for it went crooked a bit, wavered, and disappeared somehow on the other side. Somewhere on that road stood a huge building which would swallow me up for 5 years. Why had I ever wanted to leave all the familiar things around me? I could hardly understand. Why people had to grow up and leave home? I couldn't understand either. I looked first at the road and then into the dull sky as I wondered at this. I tried to imagine what the high school would really be like, but all I could see or feel was a strong tide emerging from it to sweep me into something that would give me a good shaking up. Early each morning, I walked into the high school with my lunchbox and my school books under my arm, and I walked home again at night. I have none of the textbooks now that were used at that school, for I sold them when I left. And I can't remember very much about them, except that the French book was fat and blue. One took 15 subjects in all. Business practice. In this, you learned how to write out checks and pay electric light bills, a knowledge that so far has been of no use to me. There were English, geography, mathematics, French, spelling, history, physical training, music, art, science. Here, one was taught how to light a Bunsen burner. And there must have been other subjects, for I'm sure there were 15 of them. I could never get used to high school. There were so many rooms, so many people, so many teachers. The teachers were watchful as heathen deities, and it was painful to displease them. Almost immediately, I became the object of everyone's disgust and rage. The geography teacher growled at me. The English teacher stood me up in corners. The history teacher denounced me as an idiot. The French teacher cursed my accent. In physical training, I fell off innumerable parallel bars, showing, as the instructor remarked, that I could not and never would coordinate my mind with my body. My platoon of the Cadet Corps soon discovered the only way to make progress in drill was to place me deep in the center of the ranks, away from all key positions. In manual training, I broke all sorts of precious saws and was soundly strapped for something I did to the iron lathe. For no reason that I could see, the art teacher got all purple in the face at me, took me out into the hall, and struck my defenseless hands with a leather thong. The French teacher once put me out into the hall. A far worse fate than that of being put in a corner, for the halls were hourly stalked by the principal in search of game. Anyone found in the halls he took off with him to his office, where he administered a little something calculated to keep the receiver out of the halls thereafter. Frankly, I must have been, and I was, a simpleton. But I did the silly things I did mainly because everyone expected me to do them. Very slowly, I began to be able to control myself and give at least some sort of right answer when questioned. Each night when I came home at first, Kate would ask me how I liked high school. I would reply as stoutly as I could that I was getting on all right. But gradually, I did begin to get along not too badly, and might have been a little happy if something not connected with my studies had not thrown me back into a deeper misery. This new unhappiness had something to do with the place where those students who came from the country ate their lunch. This place was called a cafeteria and was divided into a girls' cafeteria and a boys' one. After about a month of coming to the boys' cafeteria to eat my lunch, I noticed a certain young man, he couldn't be called a boy, always sat near me with his back to me at the next long table. The cafeteria was a basement room filled with 3 long tables and rows of wire-mended chairs. Now, my lunch always included a small bottle of milk. The bottle had originally been a vinegar bottle and was very difficult to drink from, unless you put your head away back and gulped it fast. One day, after I had finished my sandwiches and was drinking my milk, he turned around and said quietly, "Does baby like his bottle?" I blushed and immediately stopped drinking. Then I waited until he would finish his lunch and go away. While I waited with downcast eyes and a face red with shame, I felt a furious rush of anger against Kate and Aunt Caroline for sending milk for my lunch in a vinegar bottle. Finally, I began to see that he had finished his lunch and was not going to leave until I did. I put the vinegar bottle back in my lunchbox and walked as quickly as I could out of the boys' cafeteria, upstairs into the classroom left open during the noon hour so that the country people could study there. He followed me there and sat in the seat opposite me with what I managed to discover in the 2 times I looked at him, a derisive smile upon his face. With him sitting beside me, I had no chance of ever getting the products of New Zealand and Australia off by heart, and so I failed the geography test we had that afternoon. Day after day, he tormented me. He never hit me. He would always just stay close to me, commenting on how I ate my food or didn't drink my vinegar, and once he pulled a chair out from beneath me. Since our first meeting, I never drank anything while he was near me. Between him and my friends, the teachers, my life in first form at high school was a sort of hell, with too many tormenting fiends and not enough of me to go round so they could all get satisfaction. If I'd had the slightest spark of courage, I'd have burnt the high school down at least. At last, in the middle of November, I hit upon the plan of going over to the public library after I had eaten my lunch. Lots of other country students went there too. Most of them either giggled at magazines or hunted up art prints and photographs of classical sculpture on which they made obscene additions, or if more than usually clever, obscene comments. For over 1 happy week, the bully seemed to have lost me, for he did not appear at the library. Then I looked up from a dull book I was reading, and there he was. He had my cap in his hand and wouldn't give it back to me. How he got hold of it, I couldn't imagine. How I was to get it back from him, I couldn't imagine either. He must have given it back to me. I can't remember just how. Of course, it wasn't the sort of hat anyone else wore. It was a toque, a red and white woolen one Noreen used to wear. Every other boy at school wore a fedora, or at least a helmet. During the library period of my bullying, he sat as close up against me as he could and whispered obscenities in my ear. After 2 weeks of this, being rather desperate, I did not go to the boys' cafeteria to eat my lunch, but took my books and my lunch and went out into the streets. This was early December, and there was deep snow everywhere. I ran past the jail, down into the civic gardens, across the river, under a bridge, and down the other side of the river as fast as I could go. I had no idea where I was going to eat my lunch until I saw the town cemetery just ahead of me. It seemed fairly safe. I could eat my sandwiches under a tree and then keep warm by reading the inscriptions on the gravestones and walking about. The second day, or the third, I discovered the doors of the cemetery's mausoleum were open, and that there were 2 benches inside where you can be buried in a marble pigeonhole instead of the cold ground. To this place I came day after day, and I reveled in the morbid quiet of the place. I sat on one of the walnut benches and whispered irregular French verbs to myself, or memorized the mineral resources of Turkey, or the history of the Upper Canada Rebellion. All around and all above me, dead citizens lay in their coffins, their rings flashing in the darkness, their fingernails grown long like white, thin carrots, and the hair of the dead men grown out long and wild to their shoulders. No one ever disturbed me. People's fingernails and hair do keep on growing after they're dead, you know. Aunt Caroline read it in a book. No one ever disturbed me at the mausoleum. The wind howled about that dismal place, but no other voice howled. Only once I had some trouble in getting the heavy doors open when the factory whistles blew and it was time to start walking back to school. I usually got back to school at 20 minutes after 1, but one day the wind weakened the sound of the whistle, and I arrived at school just at 1:30. If it had been allowed, I might have run in the girls' door and not been late, but it was not allowed. And since the boys' door was at the other end of the building, by the time I had run to it, it was quite late, and I had to stay after 4. Just before Christmas, they had an at-home at the school. When pronouncing at home, the emphasis is usually on the at. Everyone goes to the at home. The tickets are usually old tickets that weren't sold for last year's operetta, cut in half. Noreen forced me to take her because she wanted to see what an at-home was like. She did not mind that I could not dance. She only wanted to sip at secondhand what she supposed to be the delightful joys of higher education. First, we went into the rooms where schoolwork was exhibited. Noreen kept expecting some of my work to be up and kept being disappointed. I was very nervous with a paintbrush, so none of my drawings were up in the art display. At the writing exhibit, none of my writing was up. I had failed to master the freehand stroke, although away from the writing teacher, I could draw beautiful writing that looked as if it had been done by the freest hand imaginable. At the geography exhibit, not one of my charts of national resources had been pinned up. Noreen was heartbroken. I had learned not to care. For instance, almost everyone's window stick got into the manual training show. Mine didn't because I had planed it down so much that it was about 1/4 of an inch thick. And as the manual training teacher pointed out, it couldn't have held up a feather. But I didn't care. Noreen and I went into the girls' gymnasium where we saw a short brown-colored movie that showed Dutch gardeners cutting hedges into the shapes of geese and chickens and ducks and peacocks. The Dutch gardeners cut away with their shears so fast that the ducks and peacocks seemed fairly to leap out of the hedges at you. Noreen and I wondered how these gardeners were going to keep employed if they carved up things that fast. Then we went into the boys' gym where young men stripped almost naked and covered with gold paint pretended to be statues. After watching them for a while, Noreen and I went up to the assembly hall where dancing was in progress, and young girls hovered shyly at the edge of the floor. Some of these shy young girls were dressed in handmade evening gowns that seemed to be made out of very thin mosquito netting, coated with icing sugar. Noreen had one of her employer's old dresses on. It was indeed a very old dress, made about 1932, I guess, for it had a hunchback sack of cloth flying out of the middle of the back. Noreen, I know, thought she looked extremely distinctive. I only thought she looked extremely extraordinary. And she did so want to dance. So we went up to the 3rd floor where she tried to teach me how to dance in one lesson. But it was no use. She asked me to introduce her to some of my friends who danced. I had no friends, but there was one boy who borrowed everything I owned almost daily. Here was a chance for him to repay me if he could dance. We soon captured him, but although Noreen clung tightly to him for a good deal of the evening, and although we led him to the mouth of the assembly hall, all the time proclaiming how nice it must be to dance, he didn't ask Noreen for a dance. So we went down into the basement to the domestic science room where punch was being served and thin cookies with silver beads in the middle of them. There was a great crowd of people in the domestic science room, and before we knew it, he had given us the slip. Then Noreen said, "Where do you eat lunch? Kate was telling me how she makes it every night for you." I replied that I ate in the boys' cafeteria. "Oh, what's that? Come on, show me." "It's not very interesting," I said, "but show me it." "Show me it," Noreen insisted stubbornly. "It's down here," I said. We went past the furnace room. "That's the furnace room, Noreen. There's the girls' cafeteria. Here's the..." It was dark inside the boys' cafeteria, and I felt along the wall just beside the door for a light button. Someone was climbing in one of the windows. Probably someone who didn't want to buy a ticket, I supposed. Probably someone who came here regularly at noon hour and thought to leave a window open for himself. Before I could tell her not to, Noreen found the light switch ahead of me and turned it on. The person climbing in the window turned out to be my friend, the bully. Like a wild animal, he stared at us for a second, then jumped back through the window. "Well, who on earth was that?" asked Noreen. "I don't know," I said, trembling all over. "Don't tremble like a leaf," Noreen said scornfully. "Why, you look and act exactly like you'd just seen a ghost. What was so frightening about him?" "Nothing," I said, leaning against the wall and putting my hand to my forehead. "Nothing." The Christmas holidays were haunted for me by my fear of what would happen at school when I went back there after New Year's. But I never complained to my father or Aunt Caroline. They would have only been too glad to hear me say I didn't want to go back. I must somehow stick it until the spring and the end of the first form at least. But I knew that before the spring came, the bully would track me down, and if I met him once again, I knew that it would be the end of me. I remember in those Christmas holidays that I went walking a lot with Kate over the fields that were dead white with snow. I wished then that we might always do that. I told Kate about my unhappiness at high school, and it drew us closer together. If I had told Noreen, she would have only called me a silly fool and made me hate her. But Kate was always more sympathetic towards me. The first morning when I was back at school, I found a note in my desk. All it said was this: "I want to see you eating where you should eat today, baby." At noon, I hid myself in the swarm of city students who were going home for lunch and arrived at the mausoleum by a roundabout way. I couldn't get over the notion that someone was following me or watching me, which could easily have been true since he had many friends. I was just in the middle of eating my lunch. I was sitting on a bench in front of the Honorable Arthur P. Higgins's tomb. I saw the bully trying to open the great doors to the mausoleum, but he couldn't seem to get them open. At last he did. All I can remember seeing is the advancing edge of the door, for I toppled off of the bench in a dead faint. When I came to, it was 1:30, so I started to walk home. My head ached violently, as if someone had kicked it, which turned out to be the case, there being a red dent just below my left eye, which turned blue after a few hours. On the way home that afternoon, I had just reached a place in the road where you can see our house, when I decided that I could not bear to go to high school any longer. So I went home and I told them that I had been expelled for walking in through the girls' door instead of the boys' door. They never doubted this was true. So little did they know of high schools and their rules. Noreen doubted me, but by the time she found out about my being expelled, it was too late to send me back. Aunt Caroline cried a bit over it all. My father said the whole thing showed that I really belonged on the farm. Only Kate realized how much school had meant to me and how desperately I had tried to adapt myself to it. That night, as I lay in bed, while outside a cold, strong river of wind roared about the house, shaking everything and rattling the dishes in the cupboard downstairs, that night I dreamt 3 dreams. I have never been able to discover what they meant. First, I dreamt that Noreen was the bully and that I caught her washing off her disguise in the water trough in the yard. Then I dreamt I saw the bully make love to Kate and she hugging and kissing him. The last dream I had was the longest of all. I dreamt that just before dawn, I crept out of the house and went through the yard. And All the letters Noreen had ever made out of grain there while feeding the chickens had all sprouted up into green letters of grass and wheat. Someone touched me on the shoulder and said sadly, "I haven't got a spoon." But I ran away without answering, across the fields, into the bush. There was a round pond there, surrounded by a grove of young chokecherry trees. I pushed through these and came to the edge of the pond. There lay the bully, looking almost pitiful, his arms and legs bound with green ropes made out of nettles. He was drowned dead, half in the water and half out of it, but face up. And in the dim light of the dawn, I knelt down and kissed him gently on the forehead.